Just thinking about misogyny in schools, what kind of misogynistic behaviour are you seeing in schools between pupils? And do you think the level of this behaviour is changing, either increasing or decreasing?
That's a really important point. Our members report to us consistently and more than they ever have done misogyny in schools between pupils, but also, I think, picking up on the question that was raised earlier, between pupils and female members of staff as well. So misogyny is becoming a very unfortunate but more deeply rooted characteristic feature of too many of our schools. That's the very clear message from our members.
Matt, do you have any views on this?
Yeah, I totally echo the what was said about the misogyny and the sexual harassment that's happening to female staff. It's rife. I don't think there's enough being done to protect female members of staff. In keeping children safe in education, there's guidance as to what constitutes child-on-child sexual harassment, but I can't find, I might be wrong, but I can't find any documentation which outlines to members of staff exactly what constitutes child-on-staff sexual harassment. In fact, I often think that as teachers we're expected, because we're adults, oh, that boy's just put something in my body, or that boy has just called me a name. Well, I'm the adult, so, and he's just a child, he's just learning. The amount of female teachers I've spoken to who have been sexually harassed, physically sexually harassed, and I mean it when I say women have had things put in their bodies by children, and then the day later, or even an hour later, they're expected to carry on teaching that child. So I really do think that the government needs to put some guidance in place. There's advice from the unions, but actually no, as far as I can see, any guidance, and of course it's happening to male teachers, but largely it's happening to female teachers. And for some female teachers, it's not just every so often, it's lesson to lesson.
I just want to jump in on a couple of points you both made. So I think you're both in agreement that there seems to be a rise in this type of behaviour in schools. What do you think's fueling that rise?
I think we've just had a really interesting session about a TV drama, but a very important one that I think has touched on many of the contributory factors that we're seeing behind this rise in misogyny in schools. I think one of the really important themes that was touched on in the evidence we've just heard was that, yes, social media plays an important part in that. Sometimes it can be an accelerant, but there are a whole range of other influences on children and young people that can lead to profoundly inappropriate behaviour. So social media is a really important aspect of it. That's absolutely right. But it's directed and has more of an impact on particular children who are vulnerable to those kind of messages. And again, that I think reflects what a lot of our members tell us about why children begin to exhibit these behaviours with all the problems that we know come with them.
Okay, thanks. And Matt?
Yeah, I think many boys are confused as to how to be a man, and many boys do want to be men. From age 11, they cannot wait, for that first pint with their dad or whatever. They're performing a masculinity, and on one hand they're hearing all these mental health campaigns saying that boys need to talk more. They talk, and then either nobody listens or all their friends poke fun at them. They're told you don't have to be strong, and yet it's always the strong boys that get picked for the team. So I think many young boys are struggling to navigate masculinity. I've had boys come to me and say things like, "Am I allowed to hold doors open? I want to have a consensual sexual relationship with my girlfriend, but what if one day we split up and she accuses me?" I think they're finding it very difficult, and actually I think the teenage brain doesn't always deal well with grey areas, and so actually just nailing your flag to the mast of misogyny is easier. Do you know what I mean? It's an easier thing to do, and it's especially easy when it only takes 23 minutes for the algorithms to push that content your way anyway. when we were at school, if you got rejected or dumped, you'd write some bad poetry, go home, cry for a week or two. What these kids are doing is they're going on the internet and they're being told, well, if you want to be attractive to women, or if you've been dumped, well, you need to assert power over her. That's what women or girls find attractive. And so, I just think they're going through some grey areas that they're finding it hard to navigate, and misogyny provides something concrete that they can understand.
Okay, thanks. And Darren, Matt mentioned he doesn't think there's much guidance from the government around the increasing levels of misogyny and sexual assault and so on and so forth in schools for female teachers. So what has been the government response from your point of view? Are you aware of a government response, and what more do you think the government needs to be doing to tackle this issue?
I think they're interested and concerned about the issue, so I think that does need to be recognised. I think it's a challenging issue, but I think they do want to engage and help work with stakeholders, work with us, work with others, to try and develop some advice and guidance in this area. This kind of sits within a number of different areas of policy. So clearly it's about behaviour in schools, and that's important. Some of the behaviours that we're talking about would be addressed through schools' behaviour policies. But it's also about safeguarding as well. So we're talking often about children who in other ways are quite vulnerable. And so to what extent are there the services, systems, early intervention mechanisms in place to make sure that children who are vulnerable and their families get the support that they need? Because perhaps one of the messages from Adolescence and some of the other accounts that are relayed, if you like, of this issue is that you've got children and families that are vulnerable. Those vulnerabilities and those pressures aren't addressed, and in the end they manifest themselves in these really unfortunate ways. So I think the government's listening on behaviour and on safeguarding, but at some point, and sooner rather than later, we are going to have to get to a point where we're providing good guidance to schools on how they can address issues of pupil on staff violence and inappropriate behaviour and abuse, and particularly that's driven by misogynist motives.
To be very clear, that guidance doesn't currently exist.
Not sufficiently, no. There's no guidance you can go to. There is, as I think was mentioned earlier, there is guidance on peer misogyny, and that I think schools do find helpful to an extent. But there isn't the extent of guidance that I think schools would want to see in relation to how pupil inappropriate behaviour in respect of adults is dealt with. Not certainly that I think is sufficient to address the nature of the problem.
Thank you. Matt, you wanted to just
so just about that, about the guidance on I think the language now is child-on-child sexual harassment in schools, so keeping children safe in education. Previously there was actually a document called Sexual Violence and Sexual Harassment in Schools, in which it very clearly outlined what behaviours constituted child-on-child sexual harassment. That document has now been withdrawn, and the information within it has been subsumed into Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is a 185-page document that reads very much like a legal document that many busy teachers don't have time to read in its entirety. Also, only part one of that documentation is actually recommended reading for teachers. The rest is primarily for school leaders. So in that first part of the documentation, it says that teachers need to know what sexual harassment looks like, but actually it's not until part 5 in which there's some guidance as to what sexual harassment actually is. So again, I think that you could be doing lots of teachers, because the teachers I speak to, and I think the evidence bears this out as well, I think nearly a quarter of teachers feel uncomfortable, 27% according to UK Feminista, feel uncomfortable dealing with sexual harassment. And when I talk to teachers, a lot of them just don't know that what they're seeing is sexual harassment. And I'm sure there's a quiz I do with teachers in some of my training sessions where I give them 4 or 5 scenarios according to the guidance. Is this sexual harassment or not? And I've never met a single teacher that's got everyone correct. And it's not because they don't want to, it's because the guidance isn't clear enough. So I really recommend that a short 2 or 3 page document that exists on its own, that is mandatory reading for all, would go a long way to solving the problem of misogyny in schools, because at the moment children, teachers, stakeholders, parents just don't really know what misogyny is, or sexual harassment is at least. Is wolf whistling sexual harassment? Not according to the guidance. Is pulling down your friend's trousers for a laugh sexual harassment? Well, yeah, according to the guidance. So, you know, there's some grey areas that need to be clarified.
Before Dr. Guinness comes in, can I just ask, because we're talking about schools and you keep saying there's no guidance in schools and teachers are reporting this, just to be clear, are we just talking about secondary schools or are we talking primary schools as well?
I'm speaking as a secondary practitioner, yes.
Okay.
We certainly hear examples of that kind of behaviour in primary schools as well as in secondary.
Okay, thank you. I think that's useful for us to know.
Did you want to come in very quickly, Dr. Guinness?
Sure.
Yeah.
Very quickly, yeah, it will be my ambition for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's something really important to see here about the different forms of misogyny that are coming out, and actually how it includes things like objectification and sexualization, both of young women and girls in the class, but also of teachers. Right the way through to things like biological essentialism and discrediting of women's ability to do different roles. And that there's often here contradictions that are coming up for young people. And I think this was one of the great things that came out of the television drama Adolescence, right? Like those contradictions where the boys were reporting back to us at the same time that the girls are outperforming them and far cleverer than them in classroom and keep on getting these plaudits, and at the same time that women are inherently not as smart as men. And it's those sorts of contradictions are quite difficult to challenge, because it's not a factual piece of information that we need to provide to young people here. It's a different type of education. And this is, we can see this in other parts of tackling this misogyny issue. It's not an information shortage that young people have. Now that over the past 10 years, we've seen a massive increase in the level of knowledge of the young people that we work with. And we work across, we're working with about 7,000 different young people a year. They're aware about these issues. Social media has actually helped in that regard. However, how they respond and understand the sorts of discussions we talk about are very variable, and quite often for them, it's they're seeking out to behave at a low level. They're seeking out to behave in these misogynistic sort of ways as a form of humour and as a form of trying to gain social capital amongst their peers, and that's leading to a broad normalisation of these sorts of behaviours amongst those cohorts. So what we need to be doing here is actually seeing this as being a primary prevention issue, as opposed to something where we're working only with the people who are already at like a extreme violence or extreme form of misogynistic type of attitude. We need to be addressing this right the way across the school, and I would say a lot of that work gets dumped on teachers without additional training, without additional support. Or with not very much, as we've already heard. And there's a huge role there for organisations like us and other experts who specialise in this work. And what's more, there is some responsibility that school teachers, other staff and parents have to take for their responsibility in actually reproducing some of these problems. Like if we run focus groups with girls or young women in schools, they'll often report back some of the gender differences in behavioural management that impact upon them, that can actually reinforce some of the sexism in classrooms. They'll report back in the most extreme examples about male teachers commenting about their appearances in front of the classroom. So these things, I'm not saying this is happening at every school and everything, but these are issues that might not be on the radar, that we need to make sure we say this is not just the young people have a problem that we're trying to fix, but we need to actually build up these institutions with proper resourcing and proper support from top to bottom.
Thank you very much. And just a final question from me. You've obviously heard the evidence from the team from Adolescence, and you mentioned it as well, Dr. Guinness. Obviously, the government's desire is for this show to be shown in all secondary schools. Do you think this is a good idea? Do you think it's a supportive idea for starting to open this conversation up? So we'll maybe start with you, Darren, and then just go quickly along the line.
Obviously a really powerful resource, and I think it's led to a lot of interesting conversations. I don't think you'd want to mandate that every school should be showing this particular drama. They may have other approaches that they might want to adopt. So as a union, we certainly wouldn't say you should do this, but I think we would very strongly commend it to schools to think about it. But also the point that I think was raised in the previous evidence session is really important. It can't just be a question of just showing the drama and that's it. There has to be a structured conversation and dialogue around it. I really was taken with the comment that the show itself is a question mark. It's not a series of answers, and it should be a prompt for, if it is used, it should be a prompt for discussion. But I think the evidence of schools that have used it in a thoughtful way is that it does prompt conversations and discussions among the pupil population that sometimes it's quite difficult to commence or begin or to stimulate. So, as I say, I think it's quite a powerful resource, and schools are using it and using it well.
Would anyone else like to contribute yet?
Yeah, absolutely. The themes are very important, and we need to have conversations about the themes, but we should have them in ways in which are well-resourced, that are expertly guided, that are best practice. And for schools to do that via showing a TV program, I think is going to be very challenging. I agree, it's up to the schools to make that decision, but it's going to be very challenging. I think if it's a question mark, the question mark has really hit home for the adult population, and I would prefer to recommend it to teachers and parents and have a conversation with them about actually how do you help your young people. Because we know that when we speak to young people in our youth advisory groups, they can recognise the stories, but they don't recognise necessarily them themselves in that character of Jamie. They're at a distance from that character, even though he's a crucial character for us as a society to understand, as are those other young people in that show.
Interesting, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Kiris.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming in. We heard the first panel there mention the manosphere. So Matt, I was really interested from your experience, to what extent do you think social media is having an impact on misogyny amongst young men and boys?
Yeah, I think it's having a huge impact. I think when the boys I do workshops with and the boys that I speak to up and down the country, the older they get now, as I think Jack mentioned in the previous panel, Andrew Tate is actually a bit of a joke now for those older boys. Also, interestingly, the popular boys. It's not the popular boys that like Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate teaches boys how to be strong and good looking, and the popular boys, rightly or wrongly, are already that in many school communities. But yeah, it's lower down again, I think Jack said, it's influencers on YouTube with just 6,000 followers. There's lots of copycat Andrew Tates, and I do think actually I wouldn't go as far to say that Andrew Tate isn't the problem. I think if we can tackle Andrew Tate and his pernicious influence, then it sends a good message to all those who are trying to grift and earn a quick buck by copying his model. For me, it's not actually the overtly misogynistic stuff. I think there's issues on there like body image. I think the emphasis on dating. I even think the mainstream media, things like Love Island, where people are talking and using phrases like body count, which is a military term for how many people you've killed, to refer to how many people you've had sex with, which is deeply problematic. And the fact that lots of parents and teachers are watching this programme with unbridled glee and talking about it. So is it any wonder that this misogyny and this toxic kind of coercive control that you see in a lot of relationships is filtering down into the male communities that exist within a school. So yes, social media is a problem, but I don't necessarily think the mainstream media should be let off either. It's not just what they're watching, it's what they're seeing in their daily lives that is having an impact too.
Yes. Oh, yeah, Daniel.
Thank you. There's there's something here which is, again, Adolescence captured it very well, but if we look at why young men are actually attracted to this thing, a lot of it is that needs to be understood in terms of their unmet needs. Like, they're going because they're confused about their relationships, about their own well-being, about what it is to be an adult and be valued in our society, etc. And I think a big clue in tackling the online spaces is actually provide those sorts of conversations and that sort of support around all of our young people through community programs, etc. There's a recent report, I think, released last week on Thursday by Movember, which was looking at the influence of manosphere influencers. And one of my colleagues sat in the back row there, was part of the research group there. But some of the interesting things for me coming out of that report was the correlation between people who, men who consume a lot of manosphere content, actually feeling more optimistic, but at the same time having worse outcomes in terms of poorer mental health, in terms of taking riskier attitudes to their own bodies, in terms of severe like self-reliance, all of those sorts of things. So we can see here that people are looking for a particular answer. They're finding it, as we've heard from a lot of different people, through these particular versions that get pushed through them subtly or explicitly through algorithms. But if we can actually address some of those underlying concerns, we'll go a long way to stopping the appeal of these more pernicious places.
That's really interesting. Darren, did you want to add anything?
Just to say, the kind of challenge that adults face in this space is that a lot of the discussion is around Andrew Tate, and we know that there have been surveys done recently about the extent to which Andrew Tate's content has penetrated that 16 to 25-year-old demographic. But I thought it's very interesting, some of the commentary around adolescence was that some of the children who are maybe in that younger phase, so say 12 to 16, didn't really know who Andrew Tate was. And if they knew about Andrew Tate, he was someone who they knew people who were older than them talked about. So it's so fast moving, and it's a real challenge, I think, for staff working in schools, people working with children, to try and make sure that they understand what's current and what's having an impact now. And again, that's something you often hear from teachers.
Yeah, and I think that's why shows like Adolescence are so important, because for me as a new parent coming into a new world, I mean, my son's 2, so I'm not new, but it is something that I'm starting to think about, having a little boy in the kind of world that I'm in the kind of work that I do. And so it's opening up that conversation. I think that's why shows like Adolescence are so powerful. But I think I want to touch on, again, something else that the first panel mentioned around the way that this content and algorithms sort of expose young people to this content. So I know video game chat rooms, for example, are something that a lot of younger boys use. So is that another sort of gateway into this misogynistic kind of content?
I don't know enough about it. I know that it can be misogynistic. But.
Yeah, and I'll have a look and send the report across, but there was a recent report that I was reading just in terms of how quickly the chat rooms, people are actually exposed to content which is either overtly sexual or misogynistic or racist and things like this that are coming up in chat rooms. I also know that there's a lot of work being done by those sorts of spaces, particularly like AI regulation of comments and of verbally made comments. So I know there's work being done in those spaces, but it does seem to be like a really important place, because it's often where parents will, let their kids jump online and play for a few hours, because for various reasons, not expecting that there's something else going on through the headphones or in the chat box on the side.
Did you want to add anything there, Darren or Matt?
I think maybe we might come on to this in terms of what can actually be done to address this problem. And I think that example maybe of game-related chat rooms, I think shows that part of this has got to be, I think you were talking earlier about critical thinking, about how children, young people can be given the skills and the tools they need to reach their own sound judgments about what they're confronted by. That seems to me to be at least part of the solution here. So how can young people perhaps test the veracity, let's say, of an assertion that they come across online or in a chat room? I think that's a really important part of it. We've got the curriculum and assessment review in England currently underway, I know that they are interested in those kind of topics and those areas and how those might be supported through the curriculum. But I think that shows that, yes, there are all kinds of interventions that we can make, that the government can make. But I think if we can give young people the confidence and the ability to maybe engage more appropriately with the material that they encounter, that might be a big part of getting to a better place.
Yeah, Daniel.
Particularly because the subcultures around each of these places are very different. And also constantly changing. So we're not going to be able to actually, no teacher, no educator whatsoever is going to be able to say, this is everything you're going to encounter and what it means and what it might be interpreted as. That's in constant flux. So it's much better to upskill the young people to do that work for themselves. And our experience as an organisation is they actually, A, enjoy it, and B, really can do that work quite successfully if given the space and a couple of tools.
Yeah, and I guess it's especially important when we're sort of quickly realising that access to this kind of content and these kind of cultures is quite insidious actually in the way that it's consumed. I wanted to come back a little bit about and talk about misogynistic influences. Matt, I think you touched on this earlier, but why do you think this misogynistic influence? I think Jack mentioned this marketing of misogyny. Why is it so successful? Why is it taking on?
I think that I think that so much of teenage life is focused on romantic or sexual success and physical attractiveness. Now, that was the case when I was at school 10 years ago. But, you know, now with social media, even the positive influencers, you know, I'm not talking about all of these toxic ones and the alpha bros, even the good guys, they've all got these six packs and, you know, these beautiful girlfriends and wives and the beautiful homes. And this is the kind of stuff that kids are seeing all of the time. And, you know, when they get into the school environment, your status in the student hierarchy is determined by how attractive you are to members of the opposite sex. Now, if you are someone who has not found their feet in the dating game at 15 years old, 16 years old, what these toxic influencers do is, firstly, they provide an explanation for your lack of success. Things like the 80-20 principle. Okay, well, you know, as a man, you're disadvantaged anyway. So not only does it provide an explanation, but it also provides a way out. You know, give me £5 a month, sign up to my blog, and I'll tell you how you can obtain wealth, how you can assert yourself over women, how you can look good. I'll give you a gym program. You know, they're monetizing it. So I think it provides very useful explanations for their failures, and also a way out of it. And there are many ways for boys to fail. We're in constant competition with each other to be the best at Fortnite, to be the best at football, to be the funniest, to be the best dressed. And you can't possibly be all of those things all at once. And so what they can guarantee is that every boy is going to be a failure in some area. And how about we tell him that we can sort him out? And that's what they're doing.
Yeah, Tanya, briefly.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to say before we move on to your next section, please. Thank you.
Briefly, Daniel.
There's something I think really interesting in this where I spoke to our schools coordinator today, and he said one of the things he really wants to get across was there's a difference in the answer the boys will give when you ask them what's a good man and what's a man that you look up to. And the first one, they'll be talking about their teacher, their brother, their dad, someone in their community that has these wonderful positive attributes that we probably all would also see. And then the other one is someone who doesn't have to go through the hard stuff that their brother and their uncle and whatever else has to go through because he's a professional athlete or a movie star or whatever else. And I think for us, somehow we've got to get through and actually help those young boys understand that being that good man is also a pathway to really good things in your life, because it's not the message that they're getting.
Thank you. Darren, I wanted to ask a little bit around what extent you think the manosphere and misogynistic online content sort of translates into more violence against women and girls, including sexual harassment on and offline?
I think it does, because I think teachers tell us that it does, that it's a significant contributor to that. So the material that children and young people access online, here we're talking about material of the misogynist nature, but there are other forms of insidious content that young people are accessing. But if we think about misogynistic material that young people access online, we know that reinforces flawed belief systems, and it does lead then to inappropriate behaviour. So there is a clear link. It's more complex. I think the evidence we heard before was really, I think, compelling in terms of this is a complex issue, and maybe sometimes it's oversimplified, but there is a clear link between what children and young people access online, how it reinforces inappropriate belief systems, and then in some circumstances how those beliefs can then manifest in behaviours, abuse, violence that are wholly inappropriate but are related to the kind of ideologies that young people have accessed.
Great, thank you very much.
You on to your next section, or you?
That's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all right. I just wanted to make sure. Rosie.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to talk more broadly about phones and social media. Matt, what impact do you think screen time, phones and social media are having on young people more broadly?
It's tiring them out. It's exhausting mentally. The pressures that it puts on them, particularly young girls, in terms of how they're meant to look and act, but also boys. Many of the boys I work with up and down the country are just tired all the time because, as has been said previously, they're taking their phones to their rooms and they're not coming off them. I'm addicted to my phone, so why shouldn't a 16-year-old be, or a 14-year-old be, especially at an age where validation is... You don't have that level of self-possession that you only acquire through adulthood. Likes and follows is all that matters for some kids. And that's understandable because that's the world that they've grown up in. I would say that I think sometimes a lot in the discourse we often forget that actually also social media does provide a positive outlet for some students. There are students who have zero confidence and would never reveal anything about themselves in the classroom or on the playground or in the real world. But a simple update to their status or, a photograph or, sharing some artwork provides a really positive outlet for them. I'm actually in favour of a social media ban, but I do think it has to be thought about very carefully because for some kids it is positive, and before we ban anything we need to think about how are we going to plug the gaps, because there must be a reason why kids are turning to social media to express themselves rather than to us. So what are we not providing them, and how are we going to find out what we're not providing them, and then how are we going to replace it?
That was a really interesting answer, thank you. Dr. Guinness, do you largely agree with that? And do you support a ban as well?
Do I largely agree with that? Yes. In terms of the sorts of impact that it's having on young people, absolutely. We're hearing similar things coming back. I think there's also this, it's linking also into those issues about what information are young people getting access to and how they're understanding it and how controlled is that and how useful is that for them. But again, I think highlighting some of the ways in which social media could connect a young person who might be extremely socially isolated. You could imagine like a young LGBTQIA+ person in a school or community that doesn't have much support for them, really finding important connection and support elsewhere. So these things are important, but certainly we would like to be living in a world where what was on the screens in front of our young people is very different to the content that's there at the moment. And ideally that they and us are not on our phones as much as we currently are.
Thank you. Do any of you want to say what you think could be done to combat the negative impact of spending so much time on social media and online? And Darren, I don't know if you think that's an answer that might be able to be related to schools.
I think there is an interesting link there, because there's a bit of a contradiction in some of the directions policy's going in. So at the moment, there was an inquiry conducted by, I think, the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Commons in the last Parliament, that was looking at young people's screen time and looking at digital poverty and those kind of issues. And the debate that they were exploring was around the use of technology in schools. So moving away from kind of paper and pencil to more on-screen kind of forms of learning. And I think one of the themes that emerged from that debate is that we could be rapidly moving into a world where children spend almost the entirety of their time at school in front of a screen. And then when they're out of school, they're in front of screens in their personal life. And so the extent of kind of dominance that screen time has on children, young people's lives, I don't think we understand it. But I think we've got to think about how we can create spaces in children's lives when they're not on screen, when perhaps they're using a pen and a piece of paper, perhaps they're engaging in physical activity, because the degree to which young people are spending so much time in front of screens and maybe spending even more time in front of screens in schools is a really interesting question that I'm not sure we've quite thought through enough yet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Dr. Guinness, you talked about the sort of content that young people are viewing online. Obviously, one of those areas is pornography, particularly violent and often misogynistic pornography. One study found that 13% of sexually active girls aged between 14 and 17 had already been choked. What do you think the role of violent and often misogynistic pornography is playing in this rise of misogynistic behaviour and attitudes?
Yeah. I mean, the choking example is very important to look at, because it's a clear demonstration of the ways in which what is considered amongst a younger generation as normal sexual behaviour has shifted markedly. And now, actually, it might be exactly the same study or a related one that showed that there's a very large percentage of young people who see that as a normal part of sexual activity, rather than being something that's either, that could be harmful. It's like, this is actually sort of what's accepted in an interaction. And that's come through because of what sorts of pornography exists that young people are accessing. And I think there's something very important here about actually the regulation that exists for pornography, particularly online pornography, and the fact that all of these things are voluntary, that we don't have the BBFC actually going through that content and applying regulation. And it seems like a very worrisome and outdated loophole that exists there for the place that actually most people are accessing pornography, if that's what they're doing. So there's something very important that we need to be doing to make sure that whatever images that young people are seeing, that we're trying to make sure that those are being accompanied by information for those young people around. Sorry, I want to be very clear here. We're not trying to show porn to young people. That's really important. But recognizing that young people are actually coming across these images, we want to be making sure that firstly we regulate what is out there and what is in the mainstream. And then secondly, that we're actually giving the young people the ability to have some literacy around that content and to actually understand that this isn't where you get your information about what a healthy relationship is. We're not, a lot of the porn that's consumed doesn't show consent conversations or people actually saying, I don't want this, not talking about desires. It shows a lot of racialized sort of ideas get pushed forward. A lot of ideas are placed there which normalize violence or normalize these sorts of interactions. So it's very important that young people are also given very comprehensive education around, well, what are healthy relationships and how do you form those healthy relationships with somebody? That's a really crucial part of this picture.
Thank you very much. Christine.
Thank you. I wondered if we could ask Matt, first of all, we've talked a lot about the online challenges, but do you think there are other key challenges that face maybe young men and boys today? How are they different from previous generations? And do they feel that maybe those things are being ignored by the mainstream in politics?
Yeah,
well, I'll ask Matt first.
I think body image is a huge one. The pressure on young boys to look muscly, low body fat, six pack. I think we really underestimate the toll which that has on young people, on young boys particularly. I think that academic underperformance in relation to girls is a perennial problem, and that's because of societal expectations around what it is to be a man. I think that there is this crisis of connection. I think that when boys get to 14, 15 years old, they're far less likely to be comfortable in expressing intimate feelings, and I don't mean sexual intimate feelings, I mean tender feelings for friends. In 11 years old, a boy might say, yeah, I've got a best friend. I've literally had boys age 15 saying, of course I don't have a best friend, that's gay. Never mind the homophobia that's embedded within that idea.
No,
and so what's happening is boys are growing up in a world where not only do they not have those platonic friendships which are so crucial to our development and our happiness, but they're also existing in a world where romantic and sexual success is paramount. And if they're not getting that, but also they don't have those platonic friendships to fall back on, it's no wonder that many boys are being seduced by the ideologies, incel ideologies, for example, that exist within the manosphere, or those darker areas of the internet. So I think we really do need to think about how we can get boys to connect with one another, and how we can, at an early age, really tackle the homophobia that exists within the idea that I can't have a best friend that's male because that's gay. That's a problem.
I wonder, is there a difference, or have you detected any difference when it comes to ethnicity or class in the issues that are facing young men and boys, and maybe how they react?
You mean in social class?
Yeah.
Sorry.
And ethnicity.
Yeah, I get asked this a lot. I've been to some of the top independent schools in the country, and I've also been in some of the most socially or economically deprived areas, and I get asked this question a lot. Actually, no. I think that the pernicious influence of toxic masculinity exists within both those spheres, although it might come out a bit differently. I think perhaps in the higher echelons of society, particularly in independent schools where there might be quite a masculine sports culture, I often see what's called a lot of ironic homosexuality. So the boys are actually very intimate and very physical with each other, but almost in we're poking fun of it. Look how alpha male we are. We can touch each other in ways that really probably aren't appropriate, but that's who we are. But apart from that, you might have you've gone all over the place.
I agree with the influence of, particularly the restrictive influence of some of those ideas about expression, about asking for help, and forming relationships. I absolutely agree those things are prevalent everywhere. I think there's some really important differences in the experiences and outcomes that young men are having, and that we should take an intersectional approach in terms of both how we understand the issues and also how we respond to them. Just some examples would be a young trans man at the moment will be facing a degree of transphobia and worrying about how they fit into their community. That would be very heightened. We've got young black men reporting to us or through other sources about worries about being adultified and criminalised in various spaces. about being worried how they might be treated by authority figures, or they might be, much higher rates of exclusion, some of which have been shown to be related to some of our perceptions of young black men. We have some of those class elements being really important, and we can think about this in a regional and sort of what resources are available in different places. And if we start to look at the ways in which some areas of the country there have been a shift away from certain job types, that's really been impacting upon working class jobs that may have been stable for over several generations. And then what's being seen is that young women have been much better at actually getting that training, then upskilling and shifting their careers. And young men, for a variety of reasons, both some internalised identity things related to masculinities and related to local pride, and also some structural things about the ways programs might have been set up, and also some societal things about what jobs are spoken about as being men's jobs. We don't speak much about like this caring or these education sort of jobs as being men's jobs. For all of those reasons, those young men, those communities have massively different outcomes, whether it's around health, mental health, jobs, employment, training, well-being, healthy relationships, rates of imprisonment. All of these things impact upon the communities in really different ways, depending on class and ethnicity and disability and other things as well.
Yeah. Is there a perception amongst young men or amongst society generally that mainstream politics is just either unaware or ignoring these, and do you think that's true? Daniel, first of all.
Sure. Absolutely, yes, among a very large cohort. And it's fed via this narrative, which might be explicitly said by some people. This feminism has gone too far. Women are trying to disenfranchise you somehow as men. You've been emasculated. These sorts of explicit messages. But also these things that are reinforced in various media commentaries, even politicians talking about these points. And I think absolutely that's there. And as we start to move to put a focus on addressing men's issues, I think we need to be extremely careful not to do it in ways that creates this false sense of us versus them. If it's men versus women, we've got to wind back feminism. And I think actually we should really be looking at, partly, not entirely, but identifying the benefits that men have had through the feminist movement and through the gains that women have had. And you only have to speak to fathers who stay home with their children now to hear that story, or to men who have been learnt new skills of expressing themselves and found new pursuits to get that story coming through. And I was really heartened. I know there's a lot going on, whether it's the men's health strategy or this particular work or the work on ending violence against women and girls, lots of pieces that are coming up that could relate to this issue. And I think they all need to have that common statement that clearly says this isn't us versus them. And I was incredibly heartened. I heard one of the architects of the Irish men's health strategy, which is like global leading, well ahead of the trend. And he came in, and the first thing he said was that when they set out their policy, their intentions, they said it was going to be intersectional, that it was going to be feminist informed, and that it was going to talk about men as not being the cause of their problems, but as people who experience those problems. And for me, I was like, that's a nice, simple way to cut through a lot of this noise and link these different policy areas together.
I think there's a bit of, do those perceptions of feminism, or from what you're saying, it sounds to me as if you think those perceptions of feminism have played into the creation of this kind of manosphere attitude?
Certainly. If you think about what's the experience of a teenager who's grown up over the past 10 years, they've lived through their online lives, which is possibly one of the most important parts of their lives, have been shaped by things like Me Too, by Everyone's Invited. They've been shaped by a lot of movements that have said, we need to care about women's rights, and also they've lived through moments where there's been very, I think, harmful and simplistic messages like all men are trash or this sort of thing that they haven't been able to. It's hard for a 15-year-old to comprehend that the type of expression of built up frustration that can come out in a moment like that, which I think is important to let out, but it's hard for them to hear that and not think that's a comment about them personally. And I think that's a crucial part of that fertile ground that these misogynistic influences, plant their seeds in. Because there is a sense from some of the well, not just boys, you can see these people in politics and in the media, but there's a sense there that men have been attacked by some of these movements that have been for social progress and equality.
The evidence is already there, and we just,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Alex.
Thank you. Diana, I'm going to start with you on this one, if that's okay. What do you think of the use of the term toxic masculinity?
Yeah. Okay.
Frequently used. I use it. We all use it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes in a space as a shorthand where everyone knows what they're talking about, it's okay. It sums up. There's lots of harmful things that can be related to particular versions and expressions of masculinity, and we've spoken about them, like your mental health, violence against women, violence against other men. However, I think as an educational tool and also as a tool in public narratives, I don't think it's serving a useful purpose. I think it's alienating a lot of people, and people are, particularly men, are struggling to differentiate between toxic masculinity as a describer of a set of expectations, like a particular expression of being a man, and men in general.
Yeah.
And we can do that work of being like, there's two things here, right? But that happens in a classroom setting when you can have a discussion with people. And in a sense, the social media narrative and media narratives, I feel they've gotten away from that ability to actually explain that concept.
Is it becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Precisely. It breeds this resentment, and it breeds defensiveness, and it breeds, I'll show you what, like you think I'm toxic, I'll go and be that.
The irony. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Darren, I'd like to I'm looking at the role of men and masculinity in society, so I'm trying to draw some threads together here. And one of them is just coming back to the school's point of the misogyny from male pupils towards female staff. And I used to work in the domestic abuse sector, and we saw a vast increase in what was termed child-to-parent abuse, which was very gendered. Let's face it, the vast majority was teenage boys' abuse to mothers. Is this part of the same societal trend? Are those two things interlinked, do you think?
I think it's complex, but the case for there being a link has got to be compelling. So when you see that misogynistic abuse directed, when our members see it directed by pupils towards staff in schools, you wonder what's driving that and what kind of misaligned thinking is leading to a belief on the part of the child that is an appropriate way to behave. And the fact that you see it outside of the school as well as in school perhaps tells you something about where these beliefs are coming from and how deeply entrenched they are in some boys.
Thank you. And I am leaping around a bit, but like I said, I was trying to draw these threads together. Matt, my question for you was that we have talked today about this huge increase now on focus on body image, and what that means for young boys and men. This is something, a focus on body image is something that women have experienced for decades, and to considerable health disadvantage at times when we look at some of the consequences of plastic surgery, for instance, and many other things. Given that there seem to be in so many areas, that I've just picked one, actually similarities of experience but pitted against each other. How do we counter that? Is it with connections? Is it how do we counter that?
You mean
that
how
we're
do
all
we...
actually on the same side?
Yeah. I do think there needs to be a lot more work in schools on gender as a construct, and children in a mixed setting, for example. talking about gender and the challenges that both genders face, some of which are the same and some of which are very different. Given its grip on media, politics, relationships and society in general, employment, it beggars belief that there isn't a more structured curriculum, a gender curriculum, you know. Of course, there's all sorts of things we could teach, but when do we find the time? Yeah. But certainly I think, you know, the PSHE curriculum could go a long way to dealing with gender. And also actually you know, sex and relationships education. I've started to wonder recently, how much emphasis do we put on the relationships part? Are kids learning how to be a supportive partner? Are kids being told, you know, about online dating and what that might look like one day? Are kids being told about coercive and control? And are they being taught about how you should refer to somebody that you find attractive? You know, and I don't know if there is enough on that side of things. So many boys and girls, there is this constant binary because they've never had this shared discourse about this confusing world of adolescence, of adulthood also, which they're all trying to navigate really together, but struggling at times, you know.
Thank you. Just one more question. Daniel, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. And again, it's a slight leap. I recently had the great fortune to have a visit to Tokyo, and something was thrown into sharp relief there in a way that it hasn't been in other cities, and that was that we went to the area of the city that is all about gaming and tech, and while there, there were dozens of women in micro mini skirts handing out flyers. There were big pictures of highly sexualized manga content, etc., on billboards. It was very, 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 very visible, to the point my teenage daughter was extremely uncomfortable. Do we have are we talking about online too much more than offline, and should we be talking about the culture more generally? And is there a problem with the wider tech sector that is exacerbating this, or is it just a small isolated thing that's coming up from time to time? Do you think?
I was worried you're asking me for an analysis of Tokyo culture.
Not at all. No.
I'm glad we can go there.
Just as a micro example.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. I don't think I'm an expert on this particular thing. What I can see is that the tech sector as a whole doesn't have a great record in terms of addressing misogyny, sexism.
Bros, isn't it? Underestimate.
Yeah.
Like tech bros, isn't it?
Yeah. You don't have, I mean, even the way that leadership distribution looks globally, etc. I mean, there's not a great track record there. So there's certainly, I suspect, having not done a systemic or a cultural analysis of that space in particular, but I suspect there's some fundamental issues, and that some probably would benefit from some deep training with some people in leadership there to actually like understand and reflect upon their own experiences and how actually they show up in their decision making and who they bring into those decisions. So that I think is an important thing to look at. And then in terms of, do we speak too much about online and not about offline? I mean, I think those two things are melded together and both very important. And yes, we certainly need to be looking at some of the offline spaces. One of the things we would do with a school, for example, is get the senior leaders and teachers to reflect upon, well, what are the pictures that are up on your walls? Or what are the things that the things that students will hear and see and experience and think as they move through your school? And we find that even in really schools that are very advanced on these issues, there's still things that they can pick up and say, oh yeah, actually, maybe we should shift the photos around occasionally, so it's not just this activity or that activity that's in the limelight. So stuff like that is important for us to think about the spaces that we create and what they show, how they are going to be actually shaping the experiences and the worldviews of the young people, and to be frank, of all of us as we move through them.
Thank you, Alex. Catherine. Thank you. I want to talk a bit about role models, and some boys do go down the rabbit hole, don't they? Every boy is exposed to this content, I think, but some boys go down the rabbit hole and some boys don't. Has any research been done about whether it's a strong role model that stops them going down that rabbit hole?
I've got a lot to say about role models, particularly in schools. I think this idea that boys need male role models, I think it does huge disservice to the majority of the profession who are women, and also single mothers, also mothers who are in partnerships with men, support workers, staff working in schools. I think it does a huge disservice to them to say, I'll tell you what we need, we just need somebody who is a male. Also, the fact is, you know, for every boy who's gone off the rails for lacking a positive male role model, there's another boy who's gone off the rails because he's got some very negative male role models in his life. So I think what we're better focused on is looking at actually what makes a good role model. I suspect it isn't the possession of a penis, or, you know. I would also say that actually when you ask about the research, when we look at the research into what's good for boys and girls, actually kids don't really care about the gender of their teacher. As long as their teacher is authentic, consistent and has firm boundaries, they're happy. That's not to say that I don't think there's advantages of having, for example, more men in teaching as a visibility issue, to tell to boys, oh wow, it's okay to be nurturing, it's okay to have a job in which you're unashamedly enthusiastic about the pursuit and accumulation of knowledge. I think that's a wonderful thing. Perhaps that's where, yes, I think there's an advantage, but I wouldn't say, I'd be reluctant to say that being male is what makes the role model. I think there is some research on absent fathers, but again, the research isn't great on that. There is a suggestion that kids with absent fathers might be have periods of delinquency, but then again, what is an absent father? I think we talked about social class earlier. Many people think that an absent father is a father who just isn't around. Well, what about your dad, who's a hotshot lawyer, who is away for most of your life? You know, so again, we have to look at, well, what actually is an absent father? So I think that's a complex issue, and I think that any discourse around boys needing positive male role models needs to be carefully approached with people who are probably far more expert than I am.
Either of you want to come in on that?
It's a big debate in schools. So in terms of what proportion of teachers are men, and perhaps those teachers, just by virtue of the fact that they are men, are sometimes supposed to be able to act as role models. And I was a primary school teacher. There are some prejudices that you do see manifest back then and now. So often you'll find if you get, let's say, a 1-form entry primary school, there's one male teacher. That male teacher will almost always be allocated to year 5 or year 6 because they're seen as presenting more behaviour challenges, and men in and of themselves are innately deemed to be more effective at dealing with those behaviours. If you look at the primary sector itself, you know, you've got maybe around 9-10% of primary school teachers are men, but still around half of all primary head teachers are men. And that's about notions of leadership and how that's understood in a context. And what message does that send to girls in those primary schools about what it takes to be a leader. So I think we've got to be really careful about the characteristics we ascribe by gender to particular roles, and whether those people, just by virtue of their gender, can act as role models or are presumed to be able to act in particular ways that serve as a role model to in this case, boys.
And what role do fathers have, if you want to answer this, Daniel, in showing a positive version of masculinity?
Fathers, as with other people in young people's lives, like other adults, can play a huge role in demonstrating very positive ways of being a human and challenging like very restrictive ways, ideas and concepts of masculinity. I mean, I agree with both my fellow panelists on like, we actually need to focus on the quality of what's being put forward there. And I think there's, just as an example, there's huge social benefits and economic benefits as well that could come from different parental leave policies that opened up more opportunities for men to be with their children, or distribute that labour more evenly across couples. But the benefit for young people is really only going to be realised if we actually equip those new fathers with the skills that they need to do that work. I mean, it'd be great if we were equipping all of our new parents with that. But we do know that in our society, men aren't really generally being socialised into those roles. And so there's a bit of a catch-up piece that many men that we work with, who are, for example, in workplaces and either have been on leave or not, actually talk about learning so much more than what their wife, if they're in a heterosexual relationship, than what their wife knew about raising kids or that sort of care, and also not having access to spaces that there were other men in. They'll turn up to a young children's group and it's them and 8 women. And sometimes they feel or are made to feel as a bit of an outsider, or they just don't know, is this dealing with the sorts of issues that I'm having at a personal level? So, I think the same can be thought, same sort of thing, like how can we actually equip the men who are already in these roles to tackle the gender norms that might be in those places, whether that's teaching or as fathers, and how can we actually help them on the personal level in form and play those new parts that they weren't socialised into by their parents. Like, this is broader cultural change that we're trying to help here.
Thank you, Catherine. Matt, I just wanted to come back to what you were saying about we don't have the conversation about what a healthy relationship looks like.
Yeah.
I would probably say we never have done with our parents, but obviously there is a place which is seemingly an attractive space to have an idea of what a relationship is, and that's the online space, whether it's influencers, whether it's social media, all of that. But how do parents, caregivers and schools have those conversations in a way that is still more attractive and safe than online?
Yeah, well, that's the problem, isn't it? Oh, you want to talk to your teacher about sex and relationships? Or it's embarrassing, isn't it? Yeah, I think it starts early, doesn't it? I think the problem is, Daniel earlier mentioned pornography, for example, right? We as a society like to think that our young people, our sons and our daughters, our students are not watching pornography. All the research suggests the opposite is true. Of course they're watching pornography. So what you might get is a set of teachers or a representative body saying, do you know what, we need to talk to children about pornography. And then there's uproar in the mainstream media, stories about teachers bringing in sex toys and ridiculous things like that. That might, maybe it happened once, but it's not, all teachers want to do is talk about pornography. That's not true. But the problem is, until we get that balance right, until we get comfortable with having these frank and honest discussions in which children are not stigmatised for having watched pornography. The way we often talk about boys and girls who watch pornography is that they are somehow sexually deviant for having done that, as if we, prior to the age of 18, never felt an inch of sexual desire. Also, let's not forget that many children watch pornography because it's sent to them. It's not necessarily that they've sought it out. And so what you've got is a situation where there are all these children being made to feel that because they have watched pornography or because they've encountered it, they are somehow dirty, filthy, deviant, and therefore that's creating a real barrier to having frank and effective discussions. I mean, essentially, in answer to your question, you know, parents and teachers, I guess, but I guess the job is best served by parents, really need to be taught how to make their own children feel that they can be honest without judgment and without admonishment, if that's the word. And until we get that right, I think it's going to be really difficult. There are kids that do it. You know, there are parents. We all know. We've probably all got friends who are wonderful parents and everything's perfect, and they're having these great discussions over the dinner table and stuff. One of them's not lying, right? It's happening. It's happening somewhere. So it can be done. But I think maybe our rather Victorian attitude towards sex as a society can be a bit of a barrier.
I think we've still got that British kind of stiff upper lip about sex. Do you think that?
I think so. I think the recent furore, was it about a year ago, when did they make changes to the sex and relationships education curriculum, and the way some mainstream media, some newspapers were suggesting that all teachers are these sex-crazed deviants who are determined to watch pornography with children. It was unbelievable. No, we just want to make sure that kids, if they are going to view pornography, we want them to be able to do it critically, safely, because they are allowed to watch pornography. You know, at the moment we don't have age verification. You know, a kid can access pornography in 6 seconds. So, you know, as a society, we're allowing them to do that because we're not putting the barriers that we should be in place. And so we also, if we're going to let them watch pornography because it's so freely available, then we also need to allow parents and teachers to be able to talk about it with them without the teachers and the parents coming under fire because they want to have these frank, constructive discussions about it.
Thanks, Matt. Darren, does this kind of reporting and I guess kind of prudishness, does it stop teachers being able to have this kind of conversation, this frank, open conversation?
I think they're difficult conversations that many parents find it difficult to have, and teachers in that sense are no different. I think one of the themes of the current debate around RSHE in schools is that we can talk about what's in the curriculum and what's in the guidance, and that's important. But I think to go back to a point that was made right at the beginning is that these responsibilities just get basically thrown at teachers to try and deal with. The majority of RSHE in our schools is taught by people who aren't specialists and have received no training in RSHE. When they want to go beyond the school and look for sources of advice and support, there isn't any there. So it's left to a teacher to try and address really complex, difficult, sensitive issues with no training, no support, and frankly a curricular framework that sometimes is quite ambiguous and in a very I think heightened and sometimes controversial political and social context. All of that falls on the shoulders of a non-specialist teacher in a secondary school and in a primary school.
Thank you. Just have 2 more questions. The first one, Dr. Guinness, is around mental health. What challenges are we seeing specifically in mental health for young boys and men, and what do we need to do to improve it?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges that young people experience around the mental health are common across genders. And I mean, we've heard around body image, we've heard around pressure, we've heard things like the bullying in online spaces, things like this are having a big impact, or just the amount of time that people are spending online. In terms of men and boys in particular, we're very aware about the lack of socialization and building up of their skills at developing empathy for others, at developing empathy for themselves, at communicating their emotions, about understanding their emotions. That leaves them at a huge deficit when it comes time to actually practice self-care, or when it comes time to seek help. So we talk to each school that we go to. We're delivering about 800 workshops a year, so we have plenty of those conversations with school leaders, and we ask, what percentage of your services is being accessed by boys, and typically the answer is 25% or less of services like counselling or support or anything like this are being used by the boys at that school, typically. I mean, it varies, obviously. So they're not using those sorts of services. Sometimes those things are seen as being not their spaces for some reason, but also there's a strong narrative being ingrained into boys from a very early age, generally speaking, about you need to deal with this problem yourself. Whether that's don't be a burden on your friends, or whether that's with a young boy, if they're crying, it's like stop crying, keep on moving. Whereas maybe with a young woman or a girl, you'd ask what's happened, what's wrong. All of these sort of little things add up, and it leaves boys not practicing self-care. If we sit in a classroom, we ask, like, who here does anything? In fact, my colleague in the back will sort of ask, maybe jokingly say something like, who would run themselves a bath and light some candles? And, the boys will laugh at that concept, right? But it's actually a wonderful thing to do that's really enjoyable. And yet it's seen as not fitting into that acceptable set of things, both because it's care and because it's feminized. And I think those things really start to impact on men and boys. And then you have that layer of particular stresses that might come to them on the basis of whatever identities or whatever cultural groups or whatever social groups they fall within. And we've heard a lot about that in the first panel and from our panel. And so we're left with these people who've not been given the skills, who've been put in kind of a particular pressure cooker, and don't see that there's any services, well, too often don't recognise any services or support that is there available to them, and instead just want to solve all their problems by themselves and not talk to each other about it.
Thank you. Matt, quickly.
I just want to touch on the mental health issue, which I've previously described as the last taboo of mental health, which is anger. We all know that it's a well-trodden statistic, especially where we're talking about gender, that men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. What's often not spoken about is that many studies have actually showed women are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt to take their own lives. But men are more likely to die by suicide because of the violent methods that they use. There are lots of boys walking around who are frustrated, who are struggling, who are lonely, who are anxious, but they're also told that you can't talk about your feelings. And so what happens is you've got a lot of anger. That's problematic when we teach girls that being angry about something means you're bossy, or you're stressy, or you're sassy, or you're not ladylike, whereas lots of boys are being conditioned that overt expressions of anger, and the research backs this up, boys are far more likely to punch walls, flip desks, swear out loud, and I do think we need to think about anger. For example, punching walls. Over a 14-year career, boys come in, they're wearing these bruised knuckles like medals of their masculinity. How many teachers actually know that one study showed that the number way in which boys actually self-harm is through punching walls? We don't. And when a boy is angry, we naturally are frightened, intimidated, and of course that sort of behaviour needs to be dealt with. Any behaviour which intimidates or scares somebody else or is harmful needs to be sanctioned. But I do think we're missing a trick with when we see these overt, repeated displays of anger or aggression in some boys in schools. how often are we actually looking at that and thinking, do you know what? Yes, his anger's wrong, but does he need a kind? Does he need some sympathy? Does he need some support here? In the same way, a girl who is self-harming using another method would, and I don't think we are. I do think that there are lots of angry boys there who are demonised and not necessarily given the mental health support that I think chronically angry people should probably get. You know, I always do a thought experiment with parents and teachers. Who would you most like to be the best friends of your child? A boy who's diagnosed depressive, a boy with chronic OCD, or a boy who goes to anger management classes? And they always pick the boy who goes to anger management classes as the boy they'd least like to be friends with their own child. Because, like I say, I think anger is one of the last taboos in mental health. When in fact anger is actually as natural as love, jealousy, greed, lust, you know. I think that's something we need to think about in schools.
Thank you very much. This last question is to all three of you, but you can write to us if you don't want to say it out loud here. Our committee is open and willing to be challenged at any given step. I think the way that we've approached all of our inquiries has been that way. One of the opportunities we want to have is to be able to hear from people who do monetize misogyny, who do market misogyny, because we want to know what is at the root cause of that, what is the aim. And so if you had one or two people that you think children are listening to, young people are listening to at the moment, as we'd heard from the previous panel, it's not the Andrew Tates of this world. Who is it that we should be hearing from, do you think? And as I said, you don't have to say it out loud now if you don't want to. You can do if you do.
I can send you a long list.
Thank you. That would be great. Do you think they'd come?
Sorry?
Do you think any of them would come?
Is there going to be cameras?
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll come.
They'll come. Okay.
No, I don't. I'm being facetious.
We might not get a chance to speak.
Yeah.
That'd be worse than me.
Thank you very much. This has been a really interesting couple of panels, and really grateful for all of your time and your experience and your expertise. And as I say, if there's anything that you think you wanted to cover that you didn't get to today, please write that to us. Thank you very much. This brings this session to a close. Order.
Thank you.